Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is a special edition of CityTalk. The talk is Syria. On Saturday, August 31st, President Obama addressed the nation.
Good afternoon, everybody. 10 days ago, the world watched in horror as men, women, and children were massacred in Syria in the worst chemical weapons attack of the 21st century. Yesterday, the United States presented a powerful case that the Syrian government was responsible for this attack on its own people. Our intelligence shows the Assad regime and its forces preparing to use chemical weapons, launching rockets into highly populated suburbs of Damascus, and acknowledging that a chemical weapons attack took place. And all of this corroborates what the world can plainly see. Hospitals overflowing with victims, terrible images of the dead. All told, well over 1,000 people were murdered. Several hundred of them were children. Young girls and boys gassed to death by their own government. Now, this attack is an assault on human dignity. It also presents a serious danger to our national security. It risks making a mockery of the global prohibition on the use of chemical weapons. It endangers our friends and our partners along Syria's borders, including Israel, Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, and Iraq.
The president went on to state that he had decided on the necessity of American military intervention, limited but intervention. He said, "Having made my decision as commander-in-chief based on what I am convinced is our national security interest, I'm also mindful that I'm the president of the world's oldest constitutional democracy." 4 days later, where are we now? To help clarify a very complex and fast-moving situation is a valued guest, Richard Murphy, former U.S. ambassador to Syria, as well as representing the United States in Saudi Arabia, Mauritania, and the Philippines. He has served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern and Asian Affairs. He has been named Career Ambassador. He's been a Senior Fellow for the Middle East at the Council on Foreign Relations. Ambassador Murphy is a frequent TV commentator and widely consulted expert. Welcome back, Mr. Ambassador. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Interesting times. Could you please just talk to us about the conversation you had, I guess, on Monday on Lebanese TV?
Yeah, it was a three-way discussion. There was an Egyptian who was formerly a delegate to the Arab League. There was a former senior Syrian official from Damascus, and myself. And
this is on Lebanese TV?
It was on one of the stations. Lebanon has a good many stations. It was on one which I believe is Iranian-owned, which makes it interesting.
Very interesting. Now, how do you get on these shows?
Well, they like to hear from somebody who's had U.S. government experience, and I keep saying, look, I am not a member of the present administration, but I'll do my best to just interpret what I see.
Okay, so what's the nature of the conversation? What struck you about the conversation?
Well, what was intended as the showstopper by the Syrian who was speaking was, what gives you the right as the United States to intervene in Syria or in any country? Why do you think you've got any such right? And then he went on about the dignity that is Syria and the independence and the sovereignty and 6,000 years of recorded history. We went back to Adam and Eve at one point.
You weren't very impressed. So what? Well, so the argument is, I guess it's the fundamental paradigm for them is, what right do you have? Now, what's your response? Or what is the U.S. response?
The right is that basically, although I don't like the term world policeman, the world still needs a world policeman. And there are moments, there are situations where the outfit we thought would do it, the United Nations, the Security Council, doesn't serve that function. It should, but it's not able to do it the way the sides break down. And if no one is ready to play that role, and I'm thinking of the American role in particular,
Right.
there's uneasiness in places as far afield as Japan, in Israel, in Poland. All of these get anxious when there's evidence that America doesn't give a darn about what's going on.
So we don't not only perceive ourselves as the exceptional people who are the world's policemen, we are perceived by much of the world, both for good or ill, or all of the world for good or ill in that role.
Yeah, and it's resented. It is resented. Power is resented, and wealth is resented, etc. But the role remains one that has to be played.
So wait a second. So who gives us the right?
The mess that is the world, and our concern about global regional stability, and it's regional, which is at the top of our thinking
Sure.
at the moment about the situation in Syria. It was the use of poison gas. President Obama had stated a year ago that that would constitute a major game changer for him if it were proven that poison gas had been used.
But let me just interrupt for a moment. Was that line in the sand, if you will, smart politics? It's at least in retrospect, you know, boxing yourself in.
Well, it's never smart to box yourself in, but he was stating a principle. He's
committed to do it.
and he's committed to do something. And as Senator McCain has just said, if the United States president takes a stand and is not supported in foreign policy, then it's going to be a catastrophe.
So it all boils down to this sort of credibility argument.
Yeah.
He made a statement, drew a line in the sand, and we have to respond. Suppose if it was an unwise line in the sand, isn't it wisdom to back off from it?
I personally take some comfort from the fact that for the last 5 years you've watched a president who's not interested, not seeking a role of interventionist in world affairs. He came in to get the United States out of Iraq, to get the United States out of Afghanistan. The last thing he wants is to get sucked into another war in the Middle East or the Muslim world. And that's when he says, I intend something limited, which will deter any future use of poison gas by the regime in Syria. I believe him. That's his goal.
Okay. Then the devil's in the operational detail. What action might signal to Assad or demonstrate to Assad that he shouldn't do this anymore? How do you both deter and degrade him? What do you, almost in a military sense, and then we'll talk about the diplomacy.
Yeah. Well, deter was the phrase the government that the president first used. After their meeting yesterday, Senator McCain and Graham said that there was discussion of degrading the military capability of the Syrian regime as well as deterring action on chemical weapons. I don't know what that means.
Okay.
I don't know if anyone today knows what that means.
Or even if they know what it means. Well,
Yeah,
presumably they should, if in terms of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the military operation.
They will have submitted a whole range of options to the White House as to what could be done.
Right.
And obviously the goal is going to be to avoid civilian casualties. And we've seen the Syrian regime over the past several days evacuate certain military facilities, moving them into schools, into mosques where they're confident the Americans would not attack. But there are some fixed facilities out there which can't be moved.
Okay. That's the military. What about the diplomatic? I mean, it's not only Syria, but it is regional. I mean, you've got Turkey, you've got Jordan, you've got Iraq, you've got Iran, you've got Saudi Arabia. These are regional. What's going on?
And you've got Israel.
And Israel. Yeah. What's going on? What do you sense would be going on behind the scenes? Who are we talking to, and what are we saying? We meaning the United States.
Well, in the next, I think it's in the course of this week, the president will have appeared at the G20 conference in St. Petersburg, and 20 chiefs of state are going to hear his presentation as to why he feels we must act. Now, the second goal he has, besides deterrence, maybe degrading, but for beyond the military, was to encourage the regime to get serious about negotiations. And of course, it's not just the regime. He spent 2 years, his people have spent 2 years trying to get the opposition together. They're fragmented. They've been a very frustrating herd of cats to work with.
And some of whom would represent maybe threats to American vital interest anyway.
All right, some of them would.
Okay.
It's a whole range of opposition factions.
It's complicated.
Personally, I am not worried about the Syrian appetite to live under an al-Qaeda regime or one of its affiliates. They're not that sort of people. But those guys are out there now as part of the fighting units. They're apparently some of the best fighters on the ground. We have tried to build support for the Free Syrian Army to work with the Syrian National Council to bring them together. Both the military and the civilians have been divided, tragically divided.
Okay, let's go to Syria. First of all, what is Syria? Looking back, it's a grab bag of tribes and sects that the colonialists just sort of stitched together. So in some senses, it looks like what you've got is this rebalancing, this reorganization of what existed prior to, I guess, the First and Second World Wars.
Well, one thing keep in mind about Syria is how often the world powers from the times of the Romans and probably before the Romans have marched through the area which you now call Syria, have conquered it, have ruled it, have been thrown out of it, have divided the area up. And the last big example was after the First World War, a British-French agreement to divide that particular part of the Middle East under the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And Syria was going to be shared between the British and the French said, no, it's ours, we're going to have the mandate. And they got it, and they kept that mandate till after the Second World War. And then divisions over the decades happened so that part of Syria under the French mandate was given to Turkey, the Hatay province up north. What they call Greater Syria, which included Palestine, was of course the foundation for the state of Israel. All of it seen as one endless grab bag, and we're not going to stand for it now. And ever since the government of Hafez al-Assad, the father of the president, took over in 1970, it's been one consistent refrain: we are the leader of Arab resistance. We are the leader of steadfastness against the imperialists, the Zionists, and everybody who's anxious to tear us apart.
Now, is this their true perspective? Is this the reason, or is this a rationale, or is it both?
I think it's both. I think it's both. And I think, frankly, it got worn out as a slogan to rally behind. There are still Syrians who are very supportive of President Assad, either because they believe this slogan, or they're afraid of what will come afterwards. They see Syria, which it is, a mosaic of all kinds of sects, as you mentioned, and who have been kept in a roughly tolerant state of mind by a strongman regime.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, well, not like your family, I hope.
No. I was referring to Iraq. I was referring to Egypt, Libya, etc. No, not my family at all. Okay, so we're back to religion again. We're back to Sunni versus Shia, which you and I have talked about a dozen times over the last dozen years.
That's part of it. It's part of it, but it can be it
Who are the
can
players?
be overplayed.
Who are the
No, I
players?
mean, you've named two of the big ones, the Sunnis, the Shia, the disputes which go back to the 7th century. And you can say it's in the blood. I don't like them, and I can't explain maybe exactly why, except what they did to the
It's in the cultural
ancestors.
gene and politically
Yeah,
DNA,
yeah.
it looks like.
Okay, then there are the there's the Christians, there are the Kurds, there are the Alawites.
And Alawite, explain, Alawites are a heterodox Shia sect?
Well, they've moved closer to the Shia. They've been, in a sense, taken by the Shia of Iran, so they are Shia, they are blessed.
So
They're
we're still
supported-
fighting. I mean, this is the same story over and over and over again. It's the story in Egypt. There was the story in Iraq. I mean, this is a fundamental chasm here.
There's a chasm, but you know, bridges have been built over time. It was a society very proud of being tolerant. There were cases of intermarriage as well, not that rare, but it's always lurked in the background or the underground, the sectarian divisions that
Sure.
have been part of their history. And one thing that the regime has done is keep that under rough control.
But we've seen in Libya, Egypt, Iraq, etc., once the lid is lifted, the pressure cooker sort of explodes.
Well, yeah, so where do we go? We're not going to go in there. We're not going to take it over as the heirs of the French or the Romans or the Crusaders. That's what we stand accused of officially by the Syrian authorities today. We want to repress Syrian sovereignty. I don't think there's much of an appetite in New York at the United Nations today to field a great army of peacekeepers. So it's trying to work out a new understanding, and that's got to be done by diplomacy, by politics.
Okay, so one of the elements of what would be U.S. national interest here is that the conflict in Syria doesn't increase the risk or the reality of wider strife. Who are we talking to? I mean, we're talking to the Kurds. What are we saying to the Kurds? What are we saying to the Saudis? What are they telling us?
Well, everybody's, what is it, got a horse in the race.
Right.
And that's
And the Iranians.
that's
I
one
mean,
of the
go ahead.
dangers. The Iranians have the regime as their candidate to survive.
Right.
There may be some doubts today.
With the new government?
Well, not just with the new government, with the Iranian memory of what happened to them at the hands of Saddam Hussein's use of poison gas in the
Right,
1980s.
in the 80s war, okay.
I mean, that memory is very strong and very bitter, and that's created some
Ooh.
questions about the behavior of the regime. But they,
Now, is that at the governmental level, the street level, both in Iran? Your
well, I think the
sense?
interesting thing is there are some signs, I don't say definitive,
Go
but there are
ahead.
some signs of disagreements in the leadership level that
So there's an opportunity?
there is an opportunity. There's an opportunity with the new leadership, quite apart from this. A man who is in the new president of Iran has given signs, given hints, he would like to resolve the nuclear issue, the nuclear dispute. He would like to get something going with more open relationships with the West. How capable he is, how serious he is about doing that, time would tell. But it's a shame that this current crisis could run directly in front of that new desire in Tehran.
Well, exactly. And the way I understand it, part of the deterrence is not only deterrence of Assad using poison gas, but also the credibility of the red line we drew with Iranian nuclear capability. So we're talking, Iran is a central player here in terms of, it seems, in terms of how we're defining our national interest.
Well, you know, about 3 years ago, there was a prospect of calling together, 2 years back, an international conference group to discuss ways to get out of the tensions in Syria and get a settlement. And the then Secretary of State said, look, Iran is part of the problem, not part of the solution. Well, I don't know about that. If it's part of a problem, by definition, it could be part of a solution.
Right. Even if we have to eliminate. No, go ahead.
No. But that worry about the regional impact, if nobody took a strong stand against the chemical weapons, we did draw a line in the sand. It's a term I don't particularly like because waves come in and wash lines in the sand out.
And
very
castles
easily.
too. Go ahead.
Yeah. But there is the uncertainties that would be introduced about our word and our credibility if we did nothing. And I think that's what's driving the president today.
Okay. Let's say the United States, the Congress, does give some kind of authorization to the president to act, whether it's under the terms that he suggested or as we see as they're resolving this. What do the Turks do? What do the Saudis do? What do the Israelis do? What do the Iranians do? I mean, what do the regional actors do? Don't they have to act as well? Don't we need the Arab League? Don't we need some kind of allies? We don't have Britain.
The Arab League has condemned the regime's use of the gas. They put that out in Cairo. Well, yeah, but the Arab League has the weight of history on its shoulders. The West is back again, taking over the Middle East. That attitude
what about
is
Turkey?
There. Turkey has condemned Assad for
Do
some
they act?
years now.
I mean,
Well, they've acted by opening their borders to the refugees, to the fighters moving from Turkish territory
do they
into
allow
Syria.
U.S. overflights
Well, we haven't. Do you mean of what?
of air through Turkey
To do? I mean,
to bomb Syria?
well, we'll see. We'll see. I don't know if that's at issue, whether
Right.
our planes would actually be
Okay.
over the territory.
What about the Israelis? They're anxious.
Of course
Yeah,
they're
and they have to
anxious.
be anxious.
They have to be.
What's their role?
Well, they've changed somewhat because they had 40 years of a very peaceful border on the Golan Heights
Sure,
with the
since what,
Syrians.
67,
Since
basically.
60, well, yeah, since 67.
Uh-huh.
It's been quiet. Games have been played with Hezbollah, thanks to
Yep.
Syrian help and Iranian supplies against that border. But the Syrian border itself has been very quiet. It's been said Israel has been working steadily to eliminate its major enemies. Saddam Hussein is gone, thank you to the United States. Let's get rid of Hafiz al-Assad, or to Bashar al-Assad. I'm not so sure that's a clear-cut Israeli policy.
Okay.
But they feel very much alone when there's a question about what we are going to do. Are we going to do anything? Because what does it do to our position in their eyes
Right.
about nuclear developments in Iran?
Sure.
So they're filled with concern.
Saudis.
Saudis have come to hate Bashar al-Assad and have actively supported elements of the rebels. Look, there are a lot of governments that would be pleased some more openly than others, if he is removed. Obama has said, I'm not in this to overthrow the regime.
Right.
That's getting criticism, some flack in the area and in the Congress.
Sure.
What are you doing?
Right.
Why do we get involved at all?
Right.
And that's
And that's the whole question of, is there real substantial national security and national interest concerns?
well, he's got to make that case, and he's got to make that case both to the Congress and to the American public. And there are facts which he has access to, which the other audiences do not yet have. So I think in these coming days, we're going to expect
the UN inspectors
more.
could come back and at least state that there was gas used, even though they're not capable or willing to point the finger at any one actor.
Exactly, and they will discuss the type of gas, the intensity of gas, the facts, just the facts on the ground, not the authorship of its use.
But one could probably infer, if given a sophisticated presentation, where it came from.
Well,
We'll see.
our authorities have already
To
concluded
come to
it
that
came from the
conclusion.
regime.
Okay,
Yeah.
little bit of crystal ball. Can Assad hold on? How long? And what are sort of the systemic forces working against him and for him as well?
Well, for him is the external support thus far from the Russians. Their weapons supply has continued thus far from the Iranians. Their forces, they've had types from the Revolutionary Guard inside Syria fighting along, advising his forces. Those are two external players that have had a direct role in supporting. As I said, inside Syria, there are people who are very much afraid of what happens to them, to their communities, to their interests if he's overthrown. And there are some who believe in his message. And that's where we underestimated his strength 2 years ago when I think that statement of the president, it's time for Assad to step aside.
Right.
Well, it hasn't happened, and he's not about to step out of office. Can he be brought into a negotiation which is not where he doesn't enter the room, where his representatives don't come in and say, our position is this and you're going to accept it, just a diktat? Or is there going to be a negotiation over a transitional regime? And that's, I think, where our administration's heading.
Yeah, but I may be naive, but it seems that this guy doesn't stop until you literally take him out, in the sense of kill him in one way or another. I mean, come on, it doesn't seem that this is a reasonable actor. And too much is at stake. I mean,
he is very reasonable about his need to survive, and
right.
he is going to fight to survive. You're right.
Right, okay.
Let's see.
Let's see.
That door is opening. Do something politically, not just militarily.
Excellent.
That's the message for
Okay,
us.
excellent. Thank you. My thanks to Richard Murphy, who once again shares his insight and wisdom, even though I'm not as sanguine as I usually am after talking with you. Join us here next week on CUNY TV. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.